The cruelest deception is not when a man lies about who he is, but when he makes you believe he never loved you at all. Evelyn Hart stood before the tall mirror in her mother's bedchamber, the late autumn light fading beyond the 6-foot windows, her ivory gown falling in quiet folds around her feet like surrender. Outside, a storm gathered over the rolling acres of heartwood, wind bending the last golden leaves against the gravel drive, while inside the house hummed with restrained urgency, servants whispering, silver polished, candles trimmed, because in less than 24 hours she would marry Duke Adrian Blackwell, the man society called Ruthless, the man rumored to have frozen out rivals with a single glance and managed half the county as if it were a ledger entry. She had agreed without protest because the bank in Boston had given her father 30 days to settle debts, because 300 acres and generations of family pride could disappear with a signature, because love at 23 felt like a childish luxury measured in inches rather than miles. Yet, as her maid adjusted the satin at her shoulders, Evelyn's fingers drifted to the slim gold chain hidden beneath the lace at her throat, where a small pocket watch rested warm against her skin, its surface worn smooth from years of secret touch. The initials AB engraved inside in careful script. Adrian Blackwell. She had once whispered that name under summer constellations at 17, when a boy with earnest eyes had spoken of leaving for the city to make something of himself and promised he would return before the first frost. But the frost had come and gone, and so had he, leaving only silence and a letter that never arrived. Now another Adrian Blackwell waited at the end of this storm, a duke instead of a dream, a stranger instead of a memory, and Evelyn forced herself to believe it was coincidence, that the world was not so cruel as to place the ghost of her first love inside the title of the man she must marry for survival. Thunder rolled across the fields, low and distant, as a carriage lantern flickered at the edge of the drive, arriving earlier than expected, and for one unguarded heartbeat, she wondered if ruthless men traveled ahead of the storm or were born from it. She straightened, lifting her chin, because dignity was the only inheritance no creditor could seize, and when she finally turned from the mirror, she did not look like a bride in love or a victim led to sacrifice, but a woman prepared to step into a future she did not choose, unaware that the past she had buried was already riding through the rain toward her door, carrying a name, a secret, and a truth powerful enough to unravel everything she thought she understood about the man she was about to marry. The carriage lanterns burned through the rain like watchful eyes as the wheels rolled across the gravel drive, each turn echoing against the wide porch columns of Heartwood Manor, and Evelyn felt the sound settle deep in her chest, as if the storm had found a second heartbeat within her. From the second-floor window, she watched a tall figure step down from the carriage, broad-shouldered beneath a dark overcoat, posture controlled, movements precise. A man accustomed to being obeyed without raising his voice, and though distance blurred his features, she sensed the stillness around him, the kind that belonged not to gentleness but to authority. Her father hurried out despite the rain, hat in hand, gratitude nearly visible even from 20 yards away, while servants rushed forward with umbrellas that turned useless in the wind. Evelyn did not move at first, her fingers tightening around the small pocket watch at her throat until the cool metal pressed into her palm, because she knew that once she descended those stairs there would be no returning to the quiet illusion that this marriage was merely paperwork and duty. Downstairs, the front doors opened with ceremonial weight, and the Duke stepped inside, bringing with him the scent of rain and cold air, and when he removed his gloves there was a brief silence that seemed to rearrange the very air of the foyer. He was not old, not hardened in the way gossip had painted him, but there was something measured in his gaze as it swept across the marble floor and up the curved staircase, as if he were assessing more than architecture. Evelyn drew a steady breath and began her descent, each step deliberate, her satin skirt whispering against polished wood, and when their eyes finally met across the distance of 12 steps and the length of a chandelier's glow, time faltered in a way that felt dangerously familiar. His expression did not change, yet something flickered there, so brief she could not name it, and he inclined his head with restrained courtesy. "Miss Hart," he said, his voice low and controlled, carrying the faint trace of memory she refused to chase. "Your Grace," she replied evenly, surprised that her own voice did not betray the tremor rising beneath her ribs. Formalities followed. Polite inquiries about the storm, about the journey of nearly 60 miles from Blackwell Estate, about the comfort of the guest chambers prepared in the West Wing. But beneath every exchanged sentence lay an undercurrent neither acknowledged. When her father excused himself to discuss financial matters in the study, leaving them momentarily alone beside the grand fireplace, the Duke's gaze lowered briefly to the chain at her throat, no longer than a heartbeat, yet long enough for her pulse to stumble. "You keep something close to you," he observed, not as a question, but as quiet recognition. A reminder, she answered before caution could intervene. "Of what?" he asked, and though the room held 12 lit candles, and the fire glowed warmly behind the grate, she felt as though the temperature had dropped several degrees. "Of who I was before circumstances made my choices for me," she said, meeting his eyes without flinching. For the first time, his composure shifted, barely perceptible, like a crack beneath ice, and he stepped back, restoring distance with deliberate control. "I hope, Miss Hart, that in time you will not regret the choices before you now," he said, and something in the way he formed the word hope struck too close to memory to be coincidence. Thunder rolled again, closer this time, rattling the windows by an inch, and Evelyn understood with sudden clarity that the storm outside was not the only force approaching her door. Rain continued through the night, steady and relentless, drumming against the tall windows of Hartwood Manor, as if determined to witness what would unfold before morning. And Evelyn lay awake long after the house had quieted, staring at the faint outline of the ceiling above her bed, replaying every word the Duke had spoken beside the fire. There had been no cruelty in his tone, no cold dismissal, yet neither had there been warmth. Only restraint so precise it felt practiced, as though he were guarding something more fragile than pride. Just before dawn, unable to endure the restless ache beneath her ribs, she rose and wrapped a wool shawl around her shoulders, the hallway stretching silent and dim beyond her door, candle sconces casting thin shadows across the polished floors. She did not expect to find anyone awake at that hour, yet as she descended the back staircase toward the east corridor, she heard the faint murmur of a man's voice from the library, low and controlled, carrying through the half-closed door. She paused without intending to, because there was something in the cadence that stirred a memory too intimate to ignore. Inside, the Duke stood near the wide oak desk, speaking quietly to her father, his back partially turned, rainwater from the night before still darkening the hem of his coat hanging by the hearth. "I will settle the remaining balance in full within 30 days, he was saying, not as a negotiation but as a decision already made. "Your daughter will not know the details, Mr. Hart, and she will never be made to feel indebted." The word struck Evelyn like a shift in gravity, because ruthless men did not shield others from obligation. They used it. Her father's voice trembled with relief, yet there was hesitation there as well. "She believes this is purely an arrangement," he said carefully. "Then let her believe that until she is ready to know otherwise," the Duke replied. And for the first time there was something unguarded in his tone, a softness so brief it nearly vanished. Evelyn stepped back from the doorway before either man could notice her presence, her pulse racing not from fear but from confusion. When she turned, she found him standing in the corridor moments later, as though he had sensed her retreat. "You should not wander the halls before sunrise, Miss Hart," he said quietly. "Nor should you assume I do not hear what is spoken in my own home," she answered, meeting his gaze without lowering her chin. A flicker of surprise crossed his features, followed by something else, something almost like approval. "You heard enough to misunderstand," he said. "Then clarify it," she challenged, the words leaving her before caution could intervene. Silence stretched between them, measured in heartbeats rather than seconds. Finally he stepped closer, not enough to invade her space, but enough that she could see the faint line at the corner of his mouth tighten. "I would prefer you think me severe rather than learn how deeply I have already risked more than reputation in this house," he said. The statement lingered, heavy and unfinished, and for a moment Evelyn saw not a distant Duke, but a man standing at the edge of something he could not fully reveal. The candle beside them flickered as a draft moved through the corridor, and she realized with unsettling clarity that the true danger was not marrying a man rumored to be ruthless, but discovering he might not be ruthless at all. By late afternoon, the storm had thinned into a gray mist that clung to the fields like unfinished thoughts, and Heartwood Manor felt suspended in a fragile calm, as though the house itself were holding its breath. Preparations for the engagement dinner resumed with quiet urgency, silver arranged precisely 6 inches from each plate, crystal polished until it caught even the weakest light. Because appearances were the last defense of a family standing on uncertain ground, Evelyn moved through the drawing room with controlled grace, offering instructions in a steady voice while her mind replayed the Duke's words from the corridor at dawn, the way he had spoken of risk not as inconvenience, but as sacrifice. When he entered the room shortly before dinner, dressed in a dark formal coat that fit him with understated authority, conversation softened without anyone announcing it. He did not command attention, he absorbed it. Their eyes met only briefly, yet something unspoken passed between them, a question neither dared voice. During dinner, he spoke politely with her father about crop yields across 300 acres and the projected value of timber over the next 5 years, demonstrating knowledge so detailed it could not have been gathered overnight. And yet when the conversation shifted to childhood memories of the county fair held each September near the river, his expression changed in a way so subtle most would have missed it. There used to be a watchmaker's booth near the southern fence, he said evenly, stirring his glass of water. He would engrave initials inside pocket watches for young couples who believed their names would last forever. Evelyn's fork paused midair, because that booth had been where she once stood beside a boy with earnest eyes and dust on his boots, laughing as he insisted their initials would remain even if circumstances tried to erase them. Very sentimental for a businessman, she replied carefully. Not all investments are measured in dollars, he answered, his gaze lifting to meet hers with quiet intensity. The candlelight caught in his eyes, revealing not severity but restraint stretched thin. After dinner, as guests from neighboring estates arrived to offer formal congratulations, Evelyn felt the weight of scrutiny settle upon her shoulders. Polite smiles masking calculation, whispers drifting like invisible threads. Lady Margaret Colton leaned close enough for her perfume to linger and murmured, "You are fortunate to have secured such a decisive husband." Decisive, Evelyn repeated softly, glancing across the room where the Duke stood alone near the tall windows overlooking the darkened fields. He seemed distant, yet not detached, as though guarding a boundary only he understood. When the final guest departed and the house quieted once more, Evelyn stepped outside onto the wide porch, the air cool against her cheeks, and found him there already, standing with his hands clasped behind his back, watching the last of the mist dissolve across the acreage. "You do not appear ruthless tonight," she said without preamble. He did not turn immediately. "Appearances have always been convenient shields," he replied. "For whom?" she asked. "For those who cannot afford to reveal what they truly stand to lose," he said at last, facing her fully. The distance between them measured no more than 3 feet, yet it felt charged with years unspoken. Evelyn felt the familiar weight of the pocket watch at her throat and realized that whatever truth lay between them was no longer a coincidence, but a choice waiting to be made. The night deepened around Heartwood Manor, the sky clearing just enough for a pale crescent moon to cast silver across the 300 acres that stretched beyond the porch, and Evelyn remained standing where she was long after the Duke's last words settled between them, the air cool and steady, the silence heavier than any accusation. "Appearances have always been convenient shields," he had said, and now she studied him as if he were both fortress and fracture, wondering which parts were constructed and which were true. "You speak as though you have something to lose," she said quietly. His jaw tightened, not in anger but restraint. "Everyone does, Miss Hart," he replied. "Some of us simply learned that losing once was enough." The statement struck her with unexpected force, because there was familiarity in that cadence, in the way he measured sorrow without dramatizing it. "You assume I have never lost anything," she answered, the pocket watch warm against her collarbone as though reminding her it was not merely memory but proof. His gaze dropped again, briefly, unmistakably, to the chain at her throat. "I assume nothing about you," he said. "That would be careless. Careless men do not calculate timber yields by the acre," she replied, stepping closer by no more than a foot. yet narrowing the space between them in a way that felt intentional. Nor do they remember a watchmaker's booth near a southern fence from 10 years ago. For a fraction of a second the composure he wore like tailored fabric shifted, revealing something beneath it that did not belong to strategy. Memory is a persistent companion, he said evenly. It visits whether invited or not. The kind of memory you describe sounds chosen, she pressed. Chosen and kept. The wind lifted a strand of her hair across her cheek, and he resisted the impulse to brush it aside, his hands remaining clasped behind his back as though discipline alone kept them there. There are moments in youth that shape a man beyond title or wealth, he said at last. Moments he cannot reclaim, even if he would give everything to return to them. Her breath caught, because the words mirrored a promise once whispered beneath late summer stars, when inches had felt like eternity and the future had stretched no farther than a single season. Then why did you leave? She asked, the question escaping before caution could silence it. The instant it hung in the air she realized what she had revealed, and the night seemed to narrow around them. His eyes held hers steadily, not confused, not offended, but searching. You speak as though you know me from before, he said quietly. Perhaps I do, she replied, her voice no longer steady but unguarded. The distance between them measured less than 2 feet now, and the quiet hum of crickets in the grass below felt impossibly loud. I once believed a man would return before the first frost, she continued, each word deliberate. Instead he vanished, leaving only a name engraved inside a promise. His breath shifted, subtle but real, and for the first time since his arrival the Duke of Blackwell looked less like a ruler of estates, and more like a man standing at the edge of a truth too long delayed. The frost came sooner than expected that year, he said softly, and sometimes departure is not choice but necessity. Necessity, she repeated, the word tasting both bitter and fragile. Then tell me, Your Grace, she said, her eyes unwavering. When necessity demands silence, does it also demand forgetting? The moonlight caught the faint crest embroidered at the cuff of his sleeve, and in that stillness Evelyn understood that whatever answer he gave next would alter more than the course of her engagement. It would decide whether the past she carried in gold and memory was coincidence or confession. For a long moment he did not answer, and the silence between them stretched thinner than the line between memory and confession. The crescent moon cast a pale light across the porch, outlining the sharp planes of his face, and when he finally spoke his voice carried none of the authority he wore inside the house. Forgetting is the one thing necessity never grants, he said quietly. It only teaches a man how to live without what he cannot have. Evelyn felt the words settle into her chest like something both familiar and dangerous. Then you did remember, she said, her fingers instinctively closing around the pocket watch beneath her collar. I remembered every inch of that summer, he replied. The heat that lingered past sunset, the sound of the river beyond the southern fence, the way you insisted the future could be shaped by will alone. Her breath caught because he had described it with a precision no rumor could supply. You speak as though you were there, she whispered. I was, he answered, and the simple admission fractured the careful distance he had maintained since arriving. The air shifted, not warmer, not colder, but charged with something neither of them could retreat from. You left without explanation, she said, the hurt she had guarded for years rising despite her resolve. I left because I was given a choice that did not belong to me, he replied, his gaze steady. At 19, I learned that the name I carried was not merely mine, but bound to obligations I had not chosen. My father died that autumn, and with him came debts that threatened to dismantle everything tied to Blackwell. I was summoned, not invited, and I was told that the boy who stood beside you at the fair could not remain if the estate was to survive. The words did not excuse the silence, but they illuminated it. You could have written, she said. I did, he answered softly. Letters that were returned unopened, addressed to a household already instructed that I was no longer welcome near its daughter. Evelyn felt the world tilt by inches, because her father had never mentioned such letters, and yet the desperation she had overheard in the library at dawn now took on new shape. My father would not have, she began, then faltered. Would not have what? He asked gently. Chosen survival over sentiment. The porch seemed smaller now, the distance between them less than a foot. The scent of rain still clung faintly to his coat. grounding him in the present even as their words unraveled the past. "I believed you abandoned me," she said. "I believed you chose ambition. Ambition was chosen for me," he replied. "And for years I convinced myself that becoming what was expected would make the loss bearable. It did not." The admission was quiet, stripped of pride, and in that moment the Duke stood not as a title, but as the same young man who once promised to return before the first frost. "Why agree to this engagement, then?" she asked, her voice steadier now. "If you remembered, if you knew." "Because I learned that Heartwood stood on the edge of collapse," he said, "and I would rather be called ruthless than allow your home to fall." The truth settled between them, not triumphant, not dramatic, but undeniable. The moonlight caught the faint crest at his cuff again, and Evelyn realized that the choice before her was no longer between duty and affection, but between the story she had believed for years and the man standing inches away who had carried the same memory through a decade of silence. The confession did not dissolve the years between them. It sharpened them, giving shape to every silence that had once felt empty. Evelyn stood motionless, the pocket watch pressed against her heartbeat, as though measuring whether truth could outrun resentment. "You decided for both of us," she said at last, her voice calm, but unyielding. "You allowed me to believe I had been forgotten." Adrian did not flinch at the accusation. "I believed that if you thought me faithless, you would be free to build a life untouched by the weight of my obligations," he answered. "I would not tether you to uncertainty. Freedom built on a lie is not freedom," she replied, stepping back just enough to reclaim breath. The porch boards beneath them creaked softly in the cooling night air, and beyond the railing the fields stretched wide and indifferent, acres of land that had dictated choices for generations. "You speak of protecting Heartwood," she continued, "yet you never trusted me with the truth." His gaze lowered briefly, not in shame but in recognition. "I underestimated you," he admitted. "I believed endurance required silence. I did not realize silence could wound more deeply than departure." The honesty in his tone unsettled her more than any polished argument could have. "You stand here now with power," she said, "with title, with means, with the ability to restore everything my family might lose. But do you understand what it cost to stand alone in that first frost believing I was not worth a letter?" The question lingered between them, not sharp, but heavy. Adrian stepped forward, closing the space to less than 12 inches, yet stopping short of touch. "I understand that I mistook sacrifice for strength," he said. "And I understand that asking you to forgive what you did not cause may be the most selfish act of all." The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of damp earth from the fields below. "You intend to marry me out of responsibility," she said quietly. "Do not answer as a duke. Answer as the man who once stood beside a watchmaker's booth and believed initials could defy time." His expression softened in a way that belonged to no title. "I came to Heartwood because I learned of your father's debts." "Yes," he said, "but I asked for your hand because no other path would place me at your side without scandal. Responsibility brought me here. Love kept me." The words settled between them with unexpected steadiness. Evelyn felt the years compress into a single fragile moment. "Love is not preserved by memory alone," she said. "It requires trust." He nodded once. "Then allow me to earn what I once assumed would remain. Not as your rescuer, not as your benefactor, but as the man who failed you and intends to do better." She searched his face for calculation and found none. Only resolve stripped of pride. "If I accept this truth," she said slowly, "I do not accept it because Heartwood needs saving. I accept it because I choose to know you as you are now." His breath left him in a quiet exhale. "That is more than I deserve," he said. "Perhaps," she replied, "but it is what I require." The moonlight thinned as clouds drifted back across the sky, and in that dimming light the future before them no longer felt imposed by necessity alone. It felt, for the first time in 10 years, chosen. Morning arrived with a fragile clarity that felt almost undeserved after the night before, sunlight stretching across the 300 acres of Heartwood like a promise cautiously made. And Evelyn stood at the edge of the southern field where the grass still carried silver traces of dew, her boots sinking slightly into the softened earth. She had chosen to meet him there at first light, not within the polished safety of drawing rooms, but in the place where memory had once begun. Adrian. approached on foot rather than by carriage, dismissing the driver at the main road nearly a mile away, his stride measured yet unguarded, coat unbuttoned despite the chill. He did not greet her with formality. Instead, he stopped an arm's length away, close enough that the quiet between them felt intentional rather than uncertain. "You asked for time to decide," he said softly. "I am prepared to accept whatever that decision may be." Evelyn studied him in the clear morning light, stripped of candle, shadows and midnight confessions, searching for remnants of strategy or pride, and finding only patience. "I do not wish to be rescued," she said, "nor do I wish to be bound by gratitude. If we proceed, it must be because we stand equal in truth, not because one of us once failed the other." He inclined his head slightly. "Then let us begin as equals," he answered, "not as the Duke of Blackwell and Miss Hart, but as Adrian and Evelyn." Hearing her name spoken without title unsettled her in a way that felt intimate but not improper. She drew the pocket watch from beneath her collar and held it between them, sunlight glinting off the worn gold surface. "I carried this through every season that followed your leaving," she said. "I told myself it was foolish to keep it, and yet I never removed it." His gaze rested on the engraved initials inside, and for a brief moment he closed his eyes as if steadying something internal. "I kept the matching chain," he replied, "though I did not deserve to." The admission held no drama, only honesty. A breeze moved through the field, bending the grass in soft waves that reached toward the distant fence where the old fairgrounds once stood. "If we are to move forward," she continued, "I need more than explanation. I need assurance that when hardship comes again, and it will, you will not choose silence over trust." Adrian stepped closer, careful not to breach the boundary she still maintained, and spoke with clarity. "I cannot promise that duty will never demand sacrifice, but I can promise that you will never again be shielded from truth in the name of protection. I would rather face difficulty beside you than preserve strength alone." The simplicity of the vow carried more weight than any elaborate declaration. Evelyn felt the years between them shift, no longer an abyss but a bridge tentatively rebuilt. "Then choose with me," she said quietly, "not because Heartwood needs saving, not because Blackwell demands an heir, but because you believe what once began at a watchmaker's booth can survive what followed." Adrian met her gaze without hesitation. "I believe it has survived precisely because it was tested." The answer did not erase the past, but it transformed it. And as the morning sun climbed higher over the fields, Evelyn understood that forgiveness was not surrender. It was a deliberate act of courage, one she was finally ready to claim. The decision, once spoken beneath the open sky, altered the rhythm of Heartwood in ways no formal announcement could. By midday the estate felt lighter, as though the very walls sensed that what had begun as obligation had shifted into intention. Evelyn returned to the manor beside Adrian, not ahead of him and not behind, but aligned at his side across the wide gravel drive that stretched nearly 100 yards from the southern gate to the front steps. Servants observed the difference without comment, because the distance between two people often reveals more than any declaration. Inside, her father awaited them in the study, papers spread across the broad oak desk, his expression tense with expectation. Evelyn did not allow him to speak first. "Father," she said calmly, "this engagement will proceed, but not as rescue and not as repayment. It will proceed because I have chosen it." Mr. Hart looked from his daughter to Adrian, surprise softening into relief. Adrian answered with quiet assurance. "The settlement of debts will move forward as agreed. But Miss Hart is not bound by them. She stands here by her own will." The clarity of the statement shifted something in the room. Evelyn saw her father's shoulders ease, not from financial reprieve alone, but from witnessing her certainty. Later that afternoon, word of the confirmed engagement traveled beyond Heartwood, carried by riders across county lines, and with it came renewed whispers. Some would say she had secured advantage. Others would suggest the Duke had softened beyond reason. Neither rumor mattered now. As preparations resumed with deliberate calm, Evelyn requested a small alteration to the ceremony plans. She asked that the vows be exchanged outdoors at the southern field, within sight of the old fairgrounds where memory had once rooted itself. When Adrian learned of the request, he did not question it. He understood what it represented. That evening, As the sun lowered over the acreage and cast long shadows across the fence line, they stood together once more at the edge of the field. "The world will assume I prevailed," he said quietly. "That persistence or position won what I once lost. Let them assume what they will," Evelyn replied. "They do not know the distance between leaving and returning. They do not know the cost of silence or the courage of speaking again." He regarded her with an expression no longer guarded. "I cannot change the years that passed," he said, "but I can honor what they taught." She nodded, feeling the weight of the pocket watch no longer as reminder of absence, but as symbol of endurance. "Then let us build something that does not depend on what was taken from us," she said. "Let us build it on what we chose to preserve." The late light caught in his eyes as he answered without hesitation. "I choose you, Evelyn, not because fate corrected itself, but because you stood before me and demanded truth." The wind moved gently through the grass around them, no longer restless, and for the first time since that first frost a decade ago, the future did not feel like something to survive. It felt like something deliberately, courageously claimed. 3 days later, the southern field was transformed not by extravagance, but by intention. Rows of white chairs arranged in careful symmetry across nearly 50 yards of open grass, their backs facing the distant fence line, where a weathered sign still marked the grounds of fairs long past. Heartwood did not glitter with excess, but it stood proud, every porch rail polished, every window reflecting the clear October sky as if determined to bear witness. Guests arrived in carriages that lined the gravel drive for more than a quarter of a mile. Their murmured speculations carried lightly on the breeze. Some had expected a quiet ceremony within the manor's chapel, protected by tradition. Instead, they found the bride waiting beneath open sky, the sun casting a warm glow across the acres that had shaped her family's name. Evelyn stood at the head of the aisle with steady composure, her gown simple but deliberate, lace catching the light without ornament designed to distract from her expression. The pocket watch remained at her throat, hidden yet present, no longer an anchor of sorrow but a testament to endurance. When Adrian took his place opposite her, the murmur among the guests softened into attentive silence. He did not look toward the crowd. He looked only at her. The officiant began with customary words about duty and partnership, yet Evelyn heard them as background to something far more personal. When it was Adrian's turn to speak, he did not raise his voice, yet every word carried across the open space. "I stand before you not as the heir to Blackwell, nor as the steward of lands measured in acres and dollars," he said, "but as a man who once failed to protect the truth and has chosen never to repeat that mistake." A ripple of surprise moved through the guests, but he did not falter. "I ask not for your gratitude or your patience," he continued, turning fully toward her, "but for the chance to meet hardship beside you rather than apart." The sincerity in his tone required no embellishment. When Evelyn answered, her voice was calm, yet unmistakably resolute. "I do not accept this future because it restores what might have been lost," she said. "I accept it because I have weighed the cost of silence and chosen trust instead." She extended her hand, not tentatively but with conviction, and when his fingers closed around hers the gesture felt neither dramatic nor fragile. It felt deliberate. The vows were exchanged beneath the vast sky that had once watched two young hearts make promises without understanding their weight, and as the officiant pronounced them united, a breeze moved across the field, lifting the hem of her gown and rustling the grass in soft applause. Applause from the guests followed, polite yet genuine, but the true affirmation rested in the quiet understanding between them. As they turned together toward the gathered families and neighbors, Evelyn realized that the story whispered across the county would speak of debts resolved and alliances secured. Few would know of letters returned unopened, of frost and fairness and silence endured. Yet none of that diminished the truth standing beside her. The future before them would not be free of obligation or challenge, but it would be faced without concealment. And as they stepped forward across the grass that had witnessed both separation and return, the past no longer felt like a wound carried in secret. It felt like a foundation rebuilt with choice. The celebration lingered long after the final toast had been raised, lanterns glowing softly across the southern field as guests drifted back toward their carriages, their voices blending with the low hum of early evening crickets. Yet for Evelyn the world had narrowed to the quiet path leading from the open grass to the porch of Heartwood, where twilight wrapped the estate in a gentle hush. Adrian walked beside her without haste, their hands loosely joined, not in display but in familiarity, newly earned. The weight of the day settled over her shoulders not as burden, but as realization. Vows spoken beneath open sky carried differently than those confined within walls. They felt witnessed not only by people, but by memory itself. As they reached the steps, she paused and looked back across the acres, now touched by the final amber light of sunset. 10 years ago, I believed the measure of love was whether someone returned before the first frost, she said softly. He turned toward her. Fully, and now, he asked, now I believe. The measure is whether they remain when winter inevitably comes, she replied. The statement was not poetic but certain. Inside the manor, preparations for departure to Blackwell Estate were already underway. Trunks measured in careful rows along the hallway, each one no more than 30 inches wide, yet heavy with the artifacts of a life about to shift. Evelyn moved through the familiar rooms with composed deliberation, touching the polished banister, pausing beside the library door where she had once overheard truths not meant for her ears. Adrian followed at a respectful distance until she stopped before the study window overlooking the gravel drive. I will not ask you to leave Heartwood behind, he said quietly. It remains yours as much as it ever was. I know, she answered. But I choose to walk forward. She removed the pocket watch from her neck and opened it one final time within those walls, tracing the engraved initials with her thumb. Then she closed it gently and placed it into Adrian's palm. I carried this through silence. Now you will carry it through promise. He did not protest. Instead, he closed his fingers around it with care, as though entrusted with something more fragile than gold. I will return it to you on the first anniversary of this day, he said, not as reminder of what we lost, but of what we kept. The simplicity of the vow steadied her. Later, as the carriage rolled slowly down the long gravel drive, wheels crunching over stones for nearly half a mile before reaching the main road, Evelyn looked back only once. Heartwood stood illuminated against the darkening sky, not diminished but enduring. Beside her, Adrian remained silent, not from distance but from understanding. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and certain. Whatever seasons come, we will meet them together. She leaned back against the carriage seat, feeling not rescued nor surrendered, but aligned. Outside, the night stretched wide and unthreatening, and for the first time since that distant autumn, the approach of winter felt less like an ending and more like a season they would face, without concealment. Blackwell Estate rose from the horizon just before noon, its stone facade stretching across nearly 400 acres of rolling land that shimmered under a pale autumn sun, and as the carriage crossed the final iron gate, Evelyn felt the quiet weight of transition settle around her. This was not Heartwood with its familiar creak of floorboards and southern fields marked by childhood memory. This was older, broader, a place shaped by generations of expectation rather than survival. Servants lined the wide front steps in orderly rows, their expressions respectful yet observant, aware that the woman descending from the carriage beside their duke was not merely a bride but the future steward of everything they served. Adrian stepped down first, then offered his hand without ceremony. She accepted, not because she required assistance, but because the gesture signified partnership rather than display. Inside, the great hall stretched upward nearly 30 feet, vaulted ceilings arching above marble floors polished to mirror the afternoon light. Portraits of former Blackwell heirs lined the walls, their painted gazes dignified and distant. Evelyn paused beneath them, aware that each frame represented decisions made long before she had ever known the name Blackwell. You are not expected to become one of them, Adrian said quietly at her side. You are expected to be yourself within these walls. The reassurance was not theatrical, yet it steadied her. The housekeeper, Mrs. Langford, guided them through corridors that seemed to extend endlessly, each hallway measured in precise symmetry, until they reached a suite overlooking the eastern gardens. Tall windows framed rows of late blooming roses arranged across nearly an acre of carefully maintained ground. The roses were planted 10 years ago, Adrian explained softly. The year I returned. Evelyn turned toward him, understanding unspoken. They survived the harshest winter the county had seen in decades. I made certain of it. She moved closer to the window, observing how the blooms leaned towards sunlight despite the approaching season. Then perhaps they understand endurance better than most, she said. Later that evening, as trunks were unpacked and the estate settled into its new rhythm, Evelyn stepped alone into the eastern garden. The gravel path beneath her shoes crunched lightly, and the air carried the faint scent of petals lingering against cool stone. She traced one bloom with careful fingers, noting how its edges remained intact despite the change in temperature. Behind her, Adrian approached without haste. "This place has long been defined by duty," he said. "I do not wish our life here to be measured solely by that." She faced him beneath the fading light. "Nor will it be," she replied. "Heartwood taught me resilience. Blackwell will teach us how to sustain it." He reached into his coat and withdrew the pocket watch she had entrusted to him. "I told you I would return this on our first anniversary," he said, "but I have decided it belongs where it began." He placed it back into her hand, not as relic of loss, but as acknowledgement of continuity. She closed her fingers around it, feeling not the ache of absence but the steadiness of presence. As the sun lowered behind the estate and shadows lengthened across the garden, Evelyn understood that she had not been carried from one life to another. She had walked there willingly, and in the quiet certainty of that choice, the past no longer stood between them. It stood beside them, transformed into foundation. Winter arrived at Blackwell Estate not with fury but with quiet certainty, frost settling across the eastern gardens in delicate patterns that caught the first light of dawn, and Evelyn stood at the tall window overlooking the 400 acres now entrusted to her care, watching how the landscape endured beneath a thin veil of white. Months had passed since her arrival, and with them had come the steady rhythm of shared decisions. Evenings spent in the library where ledgers were balanced not by command, but by discussion. Mornings in the fields where she rode beside Adrian across nearly 2 miles of pasture to speak with tenants whose livelihoods depended on the land. Nothing about their life together had been dramatic, yet everything about it had been deliberate. When the first true frost of the season touched the roses in the eastern garden, she walked there before breakfast, boots pressing softly into the brittle grass, the pocket watch resting once more at her throat. She no longer wore it out of longing, but out of remembrance transformed. Adrian joined her moments later, his coat collar turned up against the chill, breath visible in the cold air. "The roses survived again," he observed quietly. "They did not survive by accident," she replied. "Someone tended them when the nights grew harsh." He regarded her with a steady warmth that no longer required defense. "And someone believed they were worth tending," he answered. She smiled faintly, not from romance alone but from recognition. The estate around them stood prepared for winter, storehouses stocked, agreements secured, debts resolved not as triumph, but as stability. Heartwood, nearly 60 miles away, had also begun to recover under new management, its fields no longer threatened by silent collapse. Evelyn felt the quiet satisfaction of choices made without concealment. "That first frost once meant loss to me," she said after a moment. "Now it feels like proof." "Proof of what?" he asked. "That what endures does so because it is chosen again and again," she replied. "Not because it is easy." He reached for her hand, not urgently but naturally, and their fingers intertwined against the cold. The eastern sky brightened in gradual shades of gold, illuminating the gardens that had once symbolized absence and now stood as testament to return. "I once believed I had to become unyielding to protect what mattered," Adrian said softly. "You taught me that strength is not silence." She looked at him steadily. "And you taught me that absence does not always mean abandonment. Sometimes it means the story has not yet finished unfolding." The wind moved lightly through the dormant branches, and in that quiet exchange there was no need for grand declarations. The years that had separated them no longer defined them. They informed them. As they turned back toward the manor, its stone walls steady against the horizon, Evelyn understood that love had not arrived in comfort. It had been rebuilt in the shadows where doubt once lived, and in the clear light of winter morning. She knew with calm certainty that some hearts only learn to beat again when held by the right hands.